"You're not safe. Act like you're my wife," the Alpha King whispered. What followed stunned everyone. The kingdom of Urandor slept uneasily under a moonless sky. The wind carried whispers of danger, winding through the high towers and empty streets of the capital. Within the palace walls, torches flickered, casting long shadows across marble floors and gilded halls. King Alaric sat upon his throne, silent and still, as though he were a statue carved from the night itself. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, watched the council in tense silence. Every noble in the room seemed to shrink beneath his gaze, their ambitious whispers faltering whenever they dared meet it. But none of that mattered tonight. None of it could protect the kingdom from what was coming. Outside the throne room, footsteps echoed faintly. They were careful, deliberate, but even the softest sound carried weight in a palace so full of secrets. Leora, a young healer from a distant village, moved through the corridors with cautious confidence. She had been summoned unexpectedly, and though her heart raced, her mind remained clear. She had a gift, though she did not yet understand its full depth. She had healed wounds no ordinary medicine could touch, and now, she felt, the kingdom itself needed her. The first time Leora had seen King Alaric, she thought she had looked upon a man carved from shadow. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as midnight and eyes that seemed to peer straight into the heart. She had heard tales of him, a ruler both feared and respected, known for his strength and his icy detachment. Yet when he had looked at her for the first time, she had felt no fear, only curiosity, and that was dangerous. As Leora stepped into the throne room, the council froze. Her presence was unexpected, unannounced. Murmurs rippled across the hall like waves on a dark lake. Alaric's eyes, sharp and calculating, landed on her. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied her, the way she held herself, the calm in her movements, the quiet determination that refused to bow even in his imposing presence. "You are Leora," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the room go still. "The healer from the village near the northern woods." Leora bowed slightly, her hands folded respectfully. "Yes, your majesty, I was told my skills might be needed." The nobles in the council exchanged quick glances. Some smirked, dismissing her. Others looked uneasy, sensing that something more than medicine had brought her here. Alaric did not offer any explanation. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "You are far from home," he said, his tone almost a whisper, "and far from safety." Leora met his gaze without faltering. "I have walked many paths, your majesty. I can protect myself." Alaric's lips curved, almost imperceptibly. It was the first sign of any expression from the man who seemed carved from ice. But his voice hardened instantly as he rose from the throne, his steps silent yet commanding. "You are not safe," he said, so quietly that only she could hear. "Act like you are my wife." The words froze her in place. The nobles gasped, exchanging scandalized glances. A healer, a king. To claim such a thing in front of the court, it was unthinkable, but Alaric's gaze did not waver. It was not an act of vanity or cruelty. It was a warning. And Leora, though startled, understood instinctively. He was not just speaking of appearances. He was protecting her. Before she could respond, a sudden noise tore through the hall, a clash of steel and a sharp cry. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, curling and twisting like living things. Panic erupted among the council. Torches flared as servants screamed, and Alaric's hand went to the hilt of his sword, though he barely moved. The shadows recoiled at his presence as if they feared him. Leora's heart raced, but she did not step back. Instead, she instinctively raised her hands, a faint glow beginning to shimmer at her fingertips. She did not understand fully what was happening, only that she was meant to act. The shadows hesitated, unsure, then shrank back entirely. Alaric's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Step back, all of you. This is not your battle." The nobles obeyed instantly, though some still stared at Leora in confusion. Alaric stepped closer to her, his presence enveloping her like a protective wall. "Do you see now why I said it?" he whispered, close enough that his breath brushed her ear. "Do not leave my side." Leora nodded slightly, though her mind was racing. She had never felt anything like the power he radiated. Not just the power of a king, but something older, darker. Something tied to the land, tied to the bloodline, tied to a curse she could feel stirring beneath the surface. That night the palace felt alive with shadows. Servants whispered of strange movements in empty halls, and guards reported fleeting glimpses of figures vanishing into walls. Leora sat in a small chamber provided for her, tending to minor injuries from the skirmish, but her mind could not rest. Alaric entered silently, standing by the doorway. For a moment he simply observed her, the flickering candlelight casting sharp shadows across his face. Leora looked up at him, trying to measure the man behind the legend. He was more than the tales had suggested. He was danger and safety, fury and control all at once. "You have power," he said softly. "I can feel it, but it is raw, untrained, dangerous." "I only do what I must," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart betrayed her. "I heal, I protect, that is all." He studied her silently. Then, in a move that surprised her, he lowered his voice even further. "The curse is real," he said, "and it feeds on fear. It will consume anyone who stands too close if they are not careful. You," he paused, looking at her with intensity, "you may be the only one it cannot touch." Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. She did not know what to say. The words themselves felt like a spell, weighing heavy in the air between them. And though the moment was brief, it was intimate, a shared understanding that neither could ignore. Suddenly, a scream rang from the outer halls. Alaric's hand went to the sword at his side, but Leora's instincts flared again. She rose, stepping forward even as he moved beside her. Light glimmered faintly around her hands, spilling into the hall. Where she stepped, shadows recoiled. Together they moved like a single force, the king and the healer, confronting dangers neither fully understood. The shadows twisted, surged, then dissipated, leaving only silence in their wake. Alaric's eyes softened briefly as he glanced at her, a rare acknowledgement of something beyond duty or fear. "You are remarkable," he murmured. Leora met his gaze, searching for any hint of pretense. She found none. He was not praising her lightly. He meant it. And in that moment she realized something profound. Alaric was not just a king, not just a ruler who commanded with fear. He was a man trapped in a legacy, bound by a curse, and somehow he had chosen to let her stand beside him. As the palace settled into uneasy quiet, Leora returned to her room. Sleep eluded her. She thought of Alaric, of the words he whispered in the throne room, of the dangerous closeness they had shared. Something had shifted. Something old and dark had stirred in response to her presence, and she feared what it meant for the days ahead. Outside, the wind whispered through the empty streets of Urendor, carrying news she could not yet hear. And above the palace, the stars seemed to flicker, watching, waiting, as if aware of the bond forming within those walls, a bond that could protect or destroy. Hours later, Leora dreamed. She was standing in a field of ashes, the sky above blood-red, and in the distance she saw a crown burning, suspended in midair. A figure approached. It was Alaric. His eyes were the same storm-dark they always were, but in them shone something new, fear, hope, and longing all at once. He reached for her hand, but before she could take it, the crown toppled, flames licking the ground, and the vision shattered into darkness. She awoke with a start, the candle by her bedside flickering wildly as though reacting to her sudden movement. Her heart pounded. Outside, a shadow moved across the palace wall, swift and deliberate. She knew, deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. That the danger was not gone, that the whispers in the wind were not idle rumors, and somewhere in the distance, a voice she could not hear clearly but could somehow feel said, "You belong to me now, and I will not let you go." The room went still. Leora held her breath. And in that silence, the story of a healer and a cursed king began to write itself, in shadows and whispers, in danger and devotion, in power and longing. The throne room, the palace, the kingdom, they would all witness what came next. And nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over the kingdom of Urindor, casting long streaks of silver light across the palace walls. Within the halls, the air was heavy with quiet tension. The previous night's events had left a mark, unseen yet palpable, a whisper of fear, a flicker of uncertainty. Even the courtiers, who prided themselves on composure, moved slower than usual, their eyes darting toward King Alaric and the newcomer, Leora. Alaric had summoned her early. The throne room, usually reserved for grand audiences and proclamations, was now quiet, save for the echo of their footsteps. Leora entered, her hands clasped gently before her, careful not to show the unease she felt. She was still learning the weight of her position. Healer, protector, and, in the eyes of the king, someone to shield from forces she barely understood. Alaric sat on the edge of his throne, his gaze sharp as ever, though softer now than the night before. Shadows clung to him like a living cloak, swirling slightly as he shifted. It was a sight that reminded Leora how dangerous he truly was, not just as a ruler, but as a man bound by forces beyond comprehension. "You slept well?" Alaric asked, his voice low, controlled, carrying the weight of command yet threaded with something gentler. Leora inclined her head. "As well as one can, Your Majesty, after last night." She did not dare speak the visions from her dream, nor the unease that had settled deep within her chest. Alaric's eyes lingered on her for a long moment. Then he rose, walking toward her with the quiet confidence of a predator aware of no rivals. "You must understand," he said, his tone shifting to something almost vulnerable, "that what happened was not a threat of chance. It was deliberate. Someone is testing you, testing me." Leora's brow furrowed. "Testing us? Why?" Alaric did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended a hand, the same hand that could command armies, that could crush threats with ease, now held in an unspoken invitation. "Because you are not just a healer," he said. "You are necessary, more than you realize." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She knew somehow that he was speaking of more than medicine. The palace had secrets older than the walls themselves, and Alaric's blood carried burdens heavier than any crown. To be necessary to him meant stepping into a world where danger lurked in every shadow. I only wish to help," she said softly, her gaze steady. "Helping is not enough," he replied. "You must survive." The morning passed in careful observation. Alaric allowed her to walk the halls freely, yet he remained close, his presence a constant, silent warning to all who might try to test her courage, or his. Courtiers whispered, some openly, about the king's interest in Leora. Some hinted at scandal, but others noticed something subtler. She did not shrink in his presence. She met his gaze with calm, sometimes defiance, and that drew him in ways the court could not understand. By midday, Alaric took her to the palace gardens, a secluded place where the grass grew tall and wild, and fountains whispered secrets older than any living soul in Urindor. The light was softer here, diffused through the leaves, and for the first time Leora felt a measure of ease. "You can speak freely here," Alaric said, his hands resting lightly on the marble edge of a fountain. "No one will overhear." Leora nodded. "Then I must ask the shadows. Last night they seemed alive. They reacted to you or to me." Alaric's gaze darkened, his fingers tightening slightly around the marble. "The curse," he said simply. "It is ancient, older than the throne, older than the palace. It feeds on fear, on anger, on desire. It will consume anyone unprepared, and it will feed on me if I do not guard myself carefully." She watched him carefully, sensing the burden he carried. "And it did not touch me," she said, almost in wonder. "No," he admitted, his voice low. "Because something about you interrupts it. The curse recognizes that you are not bound by fear, That is dangerous for them and for us." Leora swallowed. She did not fully understand, but she trusted him, as she had learned to do in moments of quiet. There was something magnetic about Alaric, a pull both protective and commanding. She knew instinctively that her life in Urindor had changed forever. They walked along the garden path in silence. Leaves rustled under their feet, the fountains murmuring between them, and the sunlight danced across his face in a way that softened the sharpness of his features. For a moment, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had carried the weight of the world too long. "Do you fear me?" he asked suddenly, turning to her. His voice was quiet, almost intimate, yet every word carried the power of command. Leora paused. "No," she replied honestly. I respect you. I sense your strength, but I do not fear you." He studied her in silence. Then slowly a shadow of a smile curved his lips. "Few have answered that way. Most would have bowed or run. That is why you are still alive." Her cheeks warmed, though she did not look away. "Then I am fortunate," she said softly, though she felt the truth in her own words. For the next few days, the bond between them grew quietly but unmistakably. Alaric allowed her to observe the council meetings, to move through the palace as she needed, yet he remained ever watchful. Whenever danger, or even the hint of it, loomed, his presence was a shield she could feel more than see. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting Urindor in shades of gold and crimson, Leora found herself alone in the northern tower. Alaric appeared without sound, his silhouette framed against the dying light. "You are restless," he observed. "I cannot sleep easily," she admitted. "There is too much I do not understand, too much I cannot control." "You are stronger than you know," he said, stepping closer. "Stronger than anyone in this palace, strong enough to face what is coming." She met his gaze. "Even you?" Alaric's expression hardened slightly. "Especially me." The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken truths. Leora sensed the tension, the quiet pull of something forbidden yet inevitable. She did not flinch. Instead, she let herself feel the gravity of his presence, the warmth behind the darkness, the protection entwined with authority. Suddenly, a clatter echoed from the halls below, a warning bell of intrusion. Alaric's hand went to his sword, his body moving with deadly grace, but Leora was already reacting. Light shimmered faintly around her hands, a pulse of power she had barely begun to understand. Together, they descended into the hall. Shadows twisted along the walls, trying to surge toward them, but Leora's glow pushed them back. Alaric moved with silent precision, his blade striking with controlled fury. They were a perfect pair, the king and the healer, each complementing the other's strength. After the intruders were driven off, masked figures who vanished before they could be identified, Alaric turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You are learning fast," he said. "Too fast, perhaps." "I must," she replied, "not just for me but for you." His eyes softened for a fleeting moment, and then the shadows returned to cling to him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do not let them see the bond forming between us. In the wrong hands, it could destroy everything." Leora nodded, understanding the risk. But inside, a quiet warmth had taken root, a bond deeper than duty or fear, something that neither shadows nor curses could sever easily. That night, as the palace settled into uneasy silence, Leora lay awake again. She thought of Alaric, of the whispered words in the throne room, of the subtle intensity of their interactions, and of the shadows that had fled from her presence. Something was awakening in the palace, and in her own heart, that she could not name. Outside, the wind carried whispers of plotting and danger, of secrets yet to be revealed. And somewhere in the darkness, unseen, eyes watched the healer and the king, noting their growing closeness, waiting for the moment when shadows might rise again. Leora shivered, not from fear, but from anticipation. For she understood this truth clearly now. The bond between them was no longer just protection. It was connection. A fragile, dangerous, beautiful connection that would either save them or destroy them. And she could feel, deep in her bones, that the next test would come not from the shadows, but from the hearts of those who claimed loyalty to the throne, and from the darkness that still lingered within the king himself. The wind rose suddenly outside her window, carrying with it a whisper, a warning, a promise, and a question she could not yet answer. Do you have the courage to stand by him, even if it costs you everything? Leora closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her soul. Somewhere deep inside, she already knew the answer. The moon hung low over the kingdom of Urendor, its pale light spilling across the jagged battlements of the palace. Inside, silence reigned, yet it was the kind of silence that spoke of danger, of whispered secrets and unseen movements. King Alaric stood in the shadowed halls, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, eyes scanning every corner, every flicker of torchlight. He was restless, uneasy. The curse that had haunted his bloodline for generations stirred within him, reacting to the growing presence of the healer who had become his shield, his companion, his silent confidant. Leora moved quietly behind him, her steps cautious yet confident. She had learned much in the past days, how to sense the shadows before they arrived, how to let the faint magic within her glow to push them back. And she had learned something more. The bond between them was no longer pretense. It was real, undeniable, and as dangerous as the curse itself. Something approaches, Alaric said quietly, his voice a low rumble that echoed faintly in the empty hallway. I can feel it. Leora's hands tingled with anticipation, the soft glow of her magic rising at her fingertips. Do you think it is them? She asked. He shook his head, his dark eyes narrowing. Not yet, but it will be, and soon. The palace is no longer safe, not for you, not for me. They reached the main hall. The windows had been barred, the heavy doors reinforced. Yet even in this fortress, shadows seemed to move of their own accord, slithering along the walls, curling around pillars. Leora's pulse quickened. She had never felt the curse so near, so alive. Alaric turned to her, his expression hardening. You must understand, Leora, that what is coming is not a test, it is a choice, and it may demand everything from us. She met his gaze. I will face it, she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. Whatever comes, I will not run. He studied her in silence, as if measuring the weight of her words against the dangers that surrounded them. Then slowly, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a touch both protective and commanding. Good, he said. Because retreat is not an option. The first attack came as the night deepened. Masked figures emerged from the shadows, their movements swift, silent, but lethal. Alaric moved with the grace of a predator, his sword striking with precision, cutting a path through the intruders. Leora's magic flared, a bright pulse that drove the shadows back. Together they were unstoppable, a blend of strength and light. But this was only the beginning. As the battle wore on, Alaric realized the true threat was not outside the palace walls, it was inside. Whispers of rebellion had reached the inner court. Nobles who coveted the throne, who feared the growing bond between the king and the healer, were plotting from within, and they were willing to use the curse to achieve their ends. Stay close, Alaric commanded, his eyes flashing with both concern and urgency. Do not falter, Leora, not now. She nodded, her hands glowing faintly as she followed him through secret passages and shadowed corridors. Every step was a test, every corner a potential trap. Yet neither of them hesitated. They reached the royal library, a place filled with ancient tomes and forgotten spells. Leora had begun to sense the depth of the magic that ran through the palace, the same magic that bound the curse to Alaric's blood. She moved among the shelves, searching for the knowledge that might save them, that might end the threat once and for all. Alaric stood behind her, silent and vigilant. For a moment, the danger seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet intensity between them. He had never shown such trust, such vulnerability, and she felt the weight of it, understanding that the bond they shared was now as much a lifeline as any weapon. Leora, he said softly, breaking the silence. If the curse takes hold fully, it may destroy us both. Are you prepared for that? She turned to him, eyes steady. If it protects you, then yes. For a brief moment their hands brushed, and the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words. The palace around them faded, leaving only the quiet intensity of their connection. Neither spoke, yet both understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Suddenly, the library doors burst open. A figure cloaked in black entered, moving with deadly purpose. Leora stepped forward instinctively, her hands glowing brighter, a shield of light forming between them and the intruder. Alaric drew his sword, shadows twisting around him as he prepared to strike. The fight was fierce, each movement precise, each attack a test of strength and skill. Yet even as they drove the intruder back, Leora sensed something deeper, a connection between the masked figure and the curse itself. This was not mere rebellion. It was a force tied to the palace, to Alaric's blood, to the very magic that had shaped Urindor for centuries. "You must go," Alaric shouted, his voice sharp. "I can handle this." "No," Leora replied, her hands flaring with light. "We face it together." The shadows surged, reacting to their bond, feeding on their fear, on their desire, on their connection. Leora felt the strain, the pull of the curse, and realized with a start that it was drawn not just to Alaric, but to both of them. The figure struck with renewed force, and in that instant Leora made a decision. She stepped fully into the light of her power, focusing every ounce of strength and magic she possessed. The glow expanded, filling the library, pushing the shadows back, forcing the intruder to retreat. But the effort left her weakened, trembling, vulnerable. Alaric caught her, holding her close as the shadows recoiled. For a moment the world was still, filled only with the warmth of his presence and the echo of the danger that had passed. "You saved me," he said softly, his voice carrying both awe and gratitude. "And you saved me," she replied, her breath shaky but steady. The intimacy of the moment was broken by the distant sounds of the palace alarms. Reinforcements would come soon, but the danger was far from over. The curse was still awake, still alive, still watching. And they both knew it. This was not the end. In the days that followed, the palace shifted. Nobles whispered, plotting, watching, waiting. Alaric's enemies within the court grew bolder, seeking any opportunity to exploit the growing bond between him and the healer. Leora remained vigilant, understanding that her role was no longer simply to heal. It was to protect, to guide, and to stand beside a king who carried not only a crown but a legacy of darkness. Alaric himself grew quieter, more introspective. He began to confide in her, revealing fragments of the curse that haunted his bloodline, the history of his family, and the choices that had led to the present danger. Leora listened, absorbing every word, every warning, every secret. She understood that their connection was more than companionship. It was a lifeline, a tether to balance the forces that threatened to consume them both. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting the palace in shades of crimson and gold, Alaric and Leora stood on the northern balcony. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and the promise of coming trials. "You have changed everything," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "The curse, it reacts to you. It has never reacted to anyone this way before." Leora felt the weight of his words. "I do not fully understand it," she admitted, "but I know this, whatever comes, we face it together." Alaric studied her, his eyes dark and intense. "Together," he echoed. The night grew colder and the palace seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the shadows, unseen eyes watched, waiting for the moment when the bond between the king and the healer might falter. But neither of them wavered. Their connection, forged in danger and tempered by trust, had become a force stronger than fear, stronger than the curse itself. Yet, despite their growing strength, a sense of foreboding lingered. The palace was no longer merely a home or a fortress. It was a battlefield, a place where magic and ambition collided, and where the shadows waited patiently for any moment of weakness. Leora shivered, not from fear, but from the awareness of what lay ahead. She had faced many trials, healed many wounds, and yet the coming days promised challenges unlike any she had encountered. The curse was alive, the enemies were close, and the bond between them, though powerful, was fragile. Suddenly, a distant cry echoed across the palace grounds, sharp and urgent. Alaric tensed immediately, his hand going to his sword, and without a word, Leora followed. Together they moved through the halls, their steps silent, their senses alert. In the shadow of the main gate, a figure had appeared, a herald of the coming storm. And as they stepped into the light, both Alaric and Leora understood one truth. The sacrifice would soon be required, and the cost would be greater than either of them had imagined. The bond between the king and the healer had grown into something undeniable, something worth fighting for. But to survive, to protect each other, they would have to face the darkness together. And in the depths of the palace, where shadows lingered and whispers warned, the first real test of that bond was about to begin. The kingdom of Erendor had never been quieter and never more dangerous. The night air was thick with smoke and the lingering scent of magic. From the palace battlements, King Alaric watched the horizon, his dark eyes scanning the lands he had sworn to protect. Beside him, Leora stood with a steady calm, her hands glowing faintly as she felt the pulse of power beneath the earth. They both knew this night would decide everything. The curse that had haunted Alaric's bloodline for centuries had awakened fully, drawn by their bond, and now demanded its reckoning. Shadows swirled across the palace walls, twisting unnaturally as though they had a will of their own. Alaric's hand rested lightly on Leora's shoulder, a touch that carried strength, comfort, and unspoken promise. "We face it tonight," he said, his voice low, steady, yet threaded with urgency. "No retreat, no second chances." Leora nodded, her heart steady despite the fear gnawing at her chest. "I am ready," she replied. "For you, for the kingdom, for us." The palace gates creaked open as the first wave of darkness surged forward, shadows born of magic, hatred, and ambition. The figures were monstrous in form yet human in intent, their movements unnatural and threatening. Alaric drew his sword, the blade catching the faint moonlight, and stepped forward with a silent command. Leora followed, her hands alight with a glow that pushed the shadows back. Together they were unstoppable, a king and a healer, a force of light and darkness combined. Yet even as they moved through the chaos, Alaric felt the pull of the curse stronger than ever. It tugged at his heart, feeding on his fear, his anger, his longing for Leora, and his desire to protect her at all costs. "You must focus," he warned, his voice tight. "Control your power or it will consume you." "I will," she said, her resolve unbroken. "But not without you." The battle raged through the halls and corridors of the palace. Shadows twisted into monstrous forms, surging toward them from every direction. Alaric struck with precision, cutting through the darkness with deadly grace, while Leora's light flared and shimmered, driving the shadows back. Yet even as they fought, both could feel the curse tightening its hold, testing them, demanding a sacrifice neither had fully prepared for. In the heart of the palace, they reached the ancient chamber where the curse had been born, a place of stone and shadows, inscribed with runes older than memory. The air here was thick with magic, oppressive and alive. Leora stepped forward, sensing the pulse of the ancient power beneath her feet. "This is it," she whispered. "The heart of the curse." Alaric nodded, his hand gripping his sword. "Once we enter, there is no turning back. The choice will be ours alone." Together, they stepped into the chamber. The shadows reacted instantly, swirling violently around them, whispering threats and warnings in a language that scraped against their minds. Leora's glow intensified, and Alaric's sword hummed with power as they faced the darkness together. The curse manifested, a figure of smoke and shadow, its voice echoing in the chamber. "You cannot escape me, Alaric," it hissed. The bond you have formed will destroy you both." Alaric stepped forward, his sword held steady. "No," he said firmly, "it will not this time." Leora's hands shone brighter, the light pushing back the darkness, but she felt the strain. The curse was stronger than anything she had faced before, and she realized with a pang that the only way to truly end it was to give herself fully to its power, to risk her life to save Alaric and the kingdom. I have to," she said softly. "It is the only way." Alaric turned to her, his eyes filled with both fear and love. "I will not let you do this alone," he said. "We face it together." "No," Leora whispered, shaking her head. "If we both enter fully, we may not survive. You must live to lead. You must live for the kingdom." Alaric's jaw tightened. "I will not abandon you. Not now. Not ever." The shadows surged again, wrapping around them, trying to separate them, to feed on their fear. Leora raised her hands, pouring every ounce of magic she had into the chamber. Light erupted, striking the curse directly. Alaric moved beside her, his sword striking in rhythm with her magic, their movements a perfect blend of power and trust. The curse shrieked, the shadows twisting violently, reacting to their bond. Alaric realized then that the curse had always been fueled not just by fear, but by the absence of trust and love. It could not withstand a bond forged in courage, devotion, and unity. Leora's glow intensified further. She could feel the magic consuming her energy, her strength waning, yet she did not falter. She focused on Alaric, on the connection between them, on the life and hope they were fighting for. "Alaric," she said, her voice steady though weak, "hold my hand, trust me." Without hesitation, he took her hand, their fingers entwining. A pulse of light erupted from their joined hands, filling the chamber with brilliance. The shadows screamed, the curse recoiling, as the bond between them grew stronger than the darkness. For a moment the world seemed to pause. Light and shadow clashed in the chamber, and the air vibrated with the raw power of magic and emotion combined. Alaric and Leora stood together, their connection unbroken, their courage unwavering. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light enveloped the curse completely. The shadows dissolved, the dark whispers vanished, and the chamber fell silent. The curse was transformed, not destroyed but bound, no longer a force of destruction but a force of protection. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifting from the palace. Leora collapsed, exhausted but alive. Alaric caught her, holding her close, his face pressed to hers. "You did it," he whispered, awe and relief mixing in his voice. "You saved us all." She smiled faintly, her strength returning slowly. "We did it," she corrected, "together." The palace slowly came back to life. Guards and servants emerged, astonished to find the shadows gone, the danger dissipated. Nobles, who had plotted and feared, now looked upon Alaric and Leora with a mixture of awe and respect. The bond that had once been whispered about in scandalous tones was now undeniable, a connection forged in courage, sacrifice, and trust. Days passed and the kingdom began to heal. The lands that had withered under the curse began to bloom again, rivers ran clear, and the people felt a renewed hope. Alaric, once feared above all else, became a ruler whose strength was tempered by compassion. Leora, once a healer unknown to the world, became a figure of quiet power and wisdom. Yet, even as peace settled, scars remained, not only on the kingdom but within their hearts. The bond between them was strong but fragile. They had faced death, magic, and betrayal, and their trust had been tested beyond measure. One evening, Alaric and Leora stood together on the palace balcony, watching the first spring blossoms open across the gardens. The sky was painted with hues of gold and rose, a promise of new beginnings. "You have changed everything," Alaric said softly, his hand brushing lightly against hers. "And you have shown me what it means to truly trust," Leora replied. They stood in silence for a long moment, letting the peace of the kingdom wash over them. The bond they shared, born in danger and tempered by sacrifice, was now unbreakable. Yet they knew that challenges would come again, always, but they would face them as they had faced the curse, together. As the night fell, a shadow lingered far below, beyond the walls of the palace, watching, but Alaric and Leora did not flinch. They had faced the darkness, survived its trials, and emerged stronger. Whatever watched them now, it would not find weakness. Leora leaned into Alaric, her head resting against his chest. "We are stronger together," she whispered. "Yes," he replied, his voice carrying both relief and determination, "and we will face whatever comes as one." The wind rustled the leaves, the palace lights shimmered softly, and for the first time in generations, Erendor slept peacefully. The curse that had haunted the land was no longer a weapon of fear. It was a reminder of courage, of love, and of the strength found in unity. In that quiet, golden night, King Alaric and Leora stood side by side, not just as ruler and healer, not just as protector and protected, but as equals, as partners, as souls who had faced the darkness and returned whole. And though the future was uncertain, one truth remained clear. Together, they could face anything. The stars shone above, silent witnesses to a bond forged in shadow, tempered by light, and sealed with the courage of two hearts unafraid to fight for one another.